These were the most brutal forms of torture used by Roman soldiers. They were not just punishments, but sophisticated psychological tools that broke the will and turned a person into a flawless cog in the military machine. This is a story about how order was maintained through fear and loyalty through constant testing of strength. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn how the ordinary distribution of food could become an instrument of humiliation, and why the most terrible punishment for a Roman was not physical violence, but complete oblivion. Let's start with the most famous but least understood Roman punishment. Crucifixion was not just a way of taking life. It was a carefully thought out and staged spectacle designed to psychologically oppress the masses. The Romans did not invent crucifixion. They perfected it as an instrument of state propaganda. The place of execution was not chosen at random. It was always a busy road, city gate, or hill overlooking the settlement. The goal was maximum publicity. Thousands of people passing by had to see the slow death of the condemned. It was a vivid and silent warning to anyone who dared to challenge the authority of Rome. The process was deliberately drawn out. The punishment could last several days, turning a person into a living monument of fear and powerlessness. It was not a quick retribution, but a long and painful demonstration of the consequences of disobedience. Crucifixion was mainly used for slaves, rebels, and the most despicable criminals. For a Roman citizen, this form of execution was considered an unthinkable disgrace. Thus, the punishment also carried a powerful social message, dividing the world into citizens and those who had no rights. The soldiers who carried out the execution acted methodically and emotionlessly. It was their job, part of the routine of maintaining order in the provinces. For them, it was nothing more than following orders, which made the process even more gruesome in its ordinariness. After the execution, the bodies were often left on the crosses for a long time. This was done to enhance the frightening effect. The sight of decomposing bodies served as a constant reminder of what happened to the enemies of the empire. Thus, crucifixion was primarily a psychological weapon. It was aimed not so much at the condemned person as at those who witnessed it. Rome was showing that its power was absolute and that resistance was futile. This punishment became one of the most powerful symbols in world history, but its original meaning was simple and cruel: to instill fear and ensure obedience. It was theater, where human life was the main backdrop. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Which aspect of this punishment do you think was more effective in maintaining order, the physical or the psychological? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about how Roman commanders turned comrades in arms into executioners for each other? Decimation was one of the rarest but most terrifying collective punishments in the Roman army. It was applied to entire units that showed cowardice in battle. The word decimation comes from the Latin decim, meaning 10. The essence of the punishment was that every 10th soldier in the guilty cohort was put to death. But the most terrifying thing was not this, but the method of selecting and carrying out the sentence. The victims were chosen by lot. The soldiers were divided into groups of 10, and each drew lots. Those who drew the unlucky lot had to accept death. The sentence was carried out by his 9 comrades from the same group. They had to stone or club their friend and fellow soldier to death. Refusal to carry out the sentence was punishable by death for all 9. This method turned punishment into an act of collective responsibility and horror. Yesterday's friends, who had shared food and fought side by side, became participants in a brutal massacre. This destroyed the bonds of brotherhood and at the same time united the survivors in mutual responsibility. The psychological effect was enormous. Decimation clearly showed that the cowardice of one unit was a crime against the entire army. It instilled in the soldiers the idea that retreating in battle could be worse than attacking the enemy. The surviving soldiers were subjected to additional humiliation. They were transferred to a barley ration instead of wheat, which was considered food for livestock. They were also forced to sleep outside the fortified camp, risking attack. Decimation was used extremely rarely, as commanders understood its destructive power. But rumors of this punishment spread by word of mouth throughout the army. A mere mention of the possibility of decimation was enough to stop panic in the ranks. This measure was not simply a punishment for cowardice. It was a control mechanism based on fear of chance and betrayal by one's own comrades. It demonstrated that for Rome, discipline was more important than the life of an individual soldier. What do you think was more frightening for a legionnaire? The very possibility of being chosen by lot, or the need to carry out the sentence against his comrade? The answer to this question is still. However, in the next chapter, we will talk about a punishment that was even more humiliating because it forced a soldier to run through the ranks of his own comrades. What if I told you that everything you believed about military brotherhood is not true? Fustuarium is a punishment that destroyed the very foundation of the legion, turning it into a crowd of judges and executioners. It was used for offenses considered deadly dangerous to the entire unit. Such offenses included sleeping on duty, leaving one's place in formation, or stealing from a comrade. Any of these actions undermined trust and endangered the lives of hundreds of other soldiers. Therefore, the punishment was demonstratively cruel and public. The procedure for the fustigation was simple and effective. The condemned soldier was brought before a military tribune, who symbolically touched him with a stick. This gesture was a signal to the entire legion. Immediately after that, the convicted soldier's comrades would attack him with sticks and stones. They would form a living corridor through which the offender had to try to run. There was virtually no chance of survival in this corridor. The main horror of the Fustuarium was that the punishment was carried out by those whom the soldier considered his family. The legion that was supposed to protect him became the source of his death. It was the highest form of social rejection. Even if the condemned man miraculously managed to escape from the camp, he was doomed. He was forbidden to return home on pain of death. He became an exile, deprived of protection, name, and future. This punishment worked as a powerful deterrent. The fear of being rejected and destroyed by his own comrades was stronger than the fear of the enemy. Every legionnaire understood that his life depended on the trust of his fellow soldiers. Fustuarium demonstrated the absolute priority of the collective over the individual. The safety of the legion was the highest value, and anyone who threatened it was immediately excluded from the collective in the most radical way. This ritual was not just a punishment, but a form of purification. The legion, as it were, got rid of the weak or unreliable element, restoring its integrity and fighting spirit. It was a cruel but effective form of maintaining discipline. Thus, the fustigation was not so much physical punishment as an act of social destruction. It deprived the soldier not only of his life, but also of his place in the only world he knew, the world of the legion. The Roman army conquered the world not only with the sword, but also with its feet. The legion's ability to move quickly over vast distances was one of Rome's main strategic advantages. But behind this mobility was an exhausting system of training and marching, which was a real test in itself. Imagine a modern soldier marching 20-30 kilometers in full gear. This is considered a serious test, even with modern equipment and logistical support. Roman legionaries made such marches daily, month after month, in all weather conditions and across all types of terrain. If you served in the legion, you would understand that war does not begin with the first battle, but with the first step in a multi-kilometer march to the battlefield. During the march, each legionnaire carried a huge load called a sarsina. Its weight could reach 40 kilograms. This load included weapons, armor, tools for building a camp, a mess kit, personal belongings, and a supply of food for several days. 40 kilograms is the weight of an adult teenager, which had to be carried on the back all day. The sarsina included not only personal equipment, but also part of the legion's common equipment. Each soldier carried a shovel for digging trenches, an axe for cutting wood, and a pickaxe for working with stone. If you tried to walk even a few kilometers with such a load, you would understand what incredible physical training was required to serve in the legion. The standard daily march was about 30 kilometers, but if necessary, the legions could make forced marches, covering up to 50 kilometers a day. This required superhuman endurance and willpower. The pace of movement was regulated by drummers and calculated to make the most effective use of the soldiers' energy throughout the day. Forced marches were undertaken in critical situations, when it was necessary to outrun the enemy or come to the aid of allies. Imagine the psychological strain of knowing that the outcome of the entire campaign depended on your speed of movement, and that there would be no opportunity to rest until evening. The march took place in all weather conditions and across all types of terrain. Soldiers marched under the scorching sun, in pouring rain, across hot sand and mountain trails. Those who fell behind were not waited for, and an inability to keep up was considered a sign of weakness. Food on the march was scarce and monotonous. The basis of the diet was grain, which the soldiers themselves ground into flour and baked into unleavened flatbread. It was high-calorie but heavy food that provided energy but no gastronomic pleasure. The marching ration was calculated based on the need to provide maximum energy value with minimum weight and volume. Soldiers received a daily allowance of wheat or barley, which they ground with hand mills directly on the march. Food was cooked over a fire using whatever materials were available, and no one cared about the taste of the food. If you ate such food for months, you would understand that food in the Legion was exclusively fuel for the body, not a source of pleasure. Discipline on the march was ironclad. The Legion moved in a strict column, maintaining battle order. Any violation could lead to chaos and make the army vulnerable to a sudden enemy attack. The Legion's column stretched for several kilometers, but each soldier knew exactly where he was and how far he was from the one in front of him. The centurions controlled the pace and order, severely punishing any deviations from the established rules. Imagine the monotony of many hours of marching in formation when you cannot speed up, slow down, or move to the side. Only endless steps in step with your comrades under the weight of the sarcina. The hardest test awaited the soldiers at the end of the day. After a 30-kilometer march with a full load, they did not rest. The Legion had to build a fortified camp, a castrum with a moat, a rampart, and a palisade. Construction of the camp began immediately upon arrival at the campsite, regardless of the soldiers' fatigue. Each legionnaire had clearly defined duties. Some dug the moat, others built the rampart, and still others prepared stakes for the palisade. Work continued until complete darkness, and only after the fortifications were completed could the soldiers think about food and rest. If you had participated in such construction after an exhausting march, you would understand that Roman military service was a test of the limits of human endurance. This daily routine turned a soldier's life into a continuous cycle of exhausting labor. Marching, construction, guard duty, rest was minimal. This system weeded out the weak and created soldiers capable of withstanding any load. Constant physical exertion and harsh living conditions meant that only the strongest and most resilient survived. The army was a mechanism of natural selection where the price of error or weakness was very high. The Roman military system deliberately created extreme conditions that turned ordinary people into hardened warriors. Those who were physically or mentally weak could not withstand the first few months of service and were discharged or deserted. Those who remained became part of an elite military machine, capable of operating in any conditions. Imagine the psychological transformation of a person who went through such a school. He knew that he was capable of overcoming any difficulties because he had already exceeded the limits of his capabilities. What do you think was more difficult for a legionnaire? Withstanding the enemy's onslaught in battle, or the daily grueling march? In the next chapter, we will learn how the construction of an ordinary camp turned into a real test. Imagine that you have walked 30 kilometers with a 40-kilogram backpack. Your muscles are burning, you are exhausted, and all you dream of is rest. But for a Roman legionnaire, the work was just beginning. A modern soldier after such a march would be entitled to rest, a hot meal, and medical care if necessary. A Roman legionnaire knew that several more hours of hard physical labor building fortifications awaited him. If you were in his position, you would understand that the concept of fatigue simply did not exist in the Roman military system. There was only the task at hand, regardless of physical condition. Every evening, regardless of fatigue, the legion had to erect a fully fortified camp. This practice was an unbreakable law of the Roman army. It ensured safety and was part of the strictest discipline. There were no exceptions to the rule of daily camp construction. Neither rain nor snow, nor the proximity of friendly territory exempted soldiers from this duty. Roman commanders understood that a single night spent without fortifications could be the last for the entire legion. Imagine the psychological pressure of knowing that relaxation and carelessness could lead to the death of thousands of comrades. This responsibility forced the soldiers to overcome any fatigue. The construction process was perfected to the point of automatism. Each unit knew its maneuver and its section of work. Some dug a moat, others built a rampart, and still others erected a palisade of sharpened stakes. Every soldier could find his place on the construction site with his eyes closed and perform the required amount of work. Standardization was so complete that the Legion could build a camp even in complete darkness, relying only on muscle memory and sound signals. If you had participated in such construction, you would have felt like part of a giant mechanism, where each cog knows its function and performs it with impeccable precision. Each soldier carried the tools for this work with him: a shovel, a pickaxe, a saw. All of these were part of the standard equipment. A legionnaire was not only a warrior, but also a builder and an engineer. The work was carried out at an incredible speed. In a few hours, a real fortress capable of withstanding a sudden attack would rise from an empty space. This speed was achieved thanks to the clear organization and standardization of all processes. The speed of construction of a Roman camp amazed contemporaries and continues to amaze historians. What would take modern engineering troops days of work with machinery, the Romans accomplished in 3-4 hours by hand. The secret lay in the perfect coordination of thousands of people, each of whom performed a strictly defined task. Imagine the spectacle. The sun is setting, and 5,000 people are working simultaneously on the plain, and literally before your eyes, a fortified city with gates, towers, and internal buildings is growing. This daily hard work was no less important a part of a soldier's training than sword fighting. It developed endurance, discipline, and a sense of camaraderie. The soldiers understood that the life of the entire legion depended on the quality of their work. Building the camp developed not only physical strength, but also the ability to work as a team under pressure and fatigue. These skills were then put to use in battle when soldiers had to act in unison in critical situations. If you had gone through such training, you would understand that true military camaraderie is born not in battle, but in overcoming daily difficulties together. Building the camp was a collective effort where everyone's contribution was important. Shirking work was impossible and severely punished. Everyone had to do their part for the common good. This routine was physically and mentally exhausting. It left no time for idleness and maintained constant tension. Soldiers were always busy, which ruled out any thoughts of rebellion or insubordination. Constant activity was a deliberate strategy of the command. An idle soldier begins to think about home, complain about the difficulties of service, and can become a source of discontent in the Legion. The continuous cycle of marching, building, and guard duty left no time to think about anything other than performing current tasks. Imagine the psychological state of a person who lives in such a rhythm for months. He becomes an ideal soldier for whom the commander's orders are more important than his own desires and needs. Roman commanders understood that an army that knows how to build also knows how to fight. The skills acquired in the construction of camps were used in the siege of cities and the construction of bridges and roads. The Legion was not only a fighting force, but also a powerful engineering tool. The versatility of Roman soldiers made the legions indispensable not only in wartime, but also in peacetime. Veterans who had completed their service became the basis for the colonization of new territories, bringing with them not only military experience, but also construction skills. If you were a Roman governor in a remote province, you would know that a single legion could not only defend the territory, but also build roads, bridges, aqueducts, and cities. Thus, daily construction was a form of constant training and disciplined maintenance. It was a test that turned recruits into hardened veterans capable of performing any task. For a soldier who had committed a crime or an enemy prisoner, there was a fate that many considered worse than a quick death. It was being sent to work in the quarries. There, a person was deprived not only of their freedom, but also of their name, becoming a nameless laborer. The working conditions in the quarries were inhumane. People labored under the scorching sun or in stuffy underground tunnels. Stone dust clogged their lungs, and the constant roar of tools drove them mad. The main task was to extract stone for grandiose Roman construction projects. Workers used primitive tools to chip huge blocks from the rock. It was monotonous, exhausting, and extremely dangerous work. Safety precautions were virtually non-existent. Collapses, falling rocks, and accidents were commonplace. The life of a quarry worker was worth almost nothing. Food was minimal, calculated only to maintain physical ability to work. Water was often dirty and rationed. This led to exhaustion and disease. Overseers maintained discipline through cruelty. Any sign of disobedience or inability to meet quotas was punished immediately. An atmosphere of fear and hopelessness prevailed everywhere. For a soldier accustomed to discipline, honor, and the status of a legionnaire, being sent to a quarry was tantamount to civil death. He lost everything that gave meaning to his life. It was a fall to the very bottom of Roman society. Working in the quarries was a slow decline. People lost their health, strength, and any hope of liberation. It was a punishment that lasted for years, with no clear end in sight. The Roman Empire was built not only on the valor of its legions, but also on the labor of thousands of such nameless slaves. Majestic temples and amphitheaters were erected from stone quarried under inhuman conditions. What do you think was the main component of this punishment? Physical suffering or complete moral destruction of the individual? In the next chapter, we will look at how the Romans used humiliation as an official punishment. In a society where honor and dignity were valued above all else, public humiliation was one of the most effective punishments. Roman commanders skillfully used shame to maintain discipline. These punishments did not cause physical harm, but they struck at the most vulnerable point, the soldier's pride. One of the most common punishments was to stand in front of the commander's tent all day long. The soldier had to stand in complete silence, in full view of the entire camp. Thousands of his comrades passed by, witnessing his disgrace. Sometimes the punishment was made more severe. The offender could be forced to stand in humiliating clothing or without a military belt. A cingulum. The belt was a symbol of a soldier's status, and its absence was tantamount to admitting that you were no longer a warrior. Another method was to change the ration. Instead of wheat, which was considered food for humans, punished soldiers were given barley. It was food for animals, and such a ration was an unambiguous hint at the status of the offender. Corporal punishment was also often humiliating. A centurion could strike a legionnaire with his vine whip or vetus. It was not so much the force of the blow that mattered as the public demonstration of authority and the soldier's subordinate position. More serious offenses could result in a demotion. For a soldier who had been striving for promotion for years, this was a devastating blow to his career and reputation. He lost the respect of his comrades and his authority. Sometimes entire units were subjected to humiliation. They could be stripped of their banners or transferred to auxiliary troops. This was a collective disgrace that fell on every soldier. The purpose of these punishments was not to break a person, but to force them to reform. Fear of shame and ridicule from comrades was a powerful incentive to maintain discipline. Roman society was built on hierarchy and reputation. Losing face was tantamount to social suicide. Commanders understood this perfectly well and used it to their advantage. These methods show how deeply the Romans understood human psychology. They knew that a blow to one's pride could be more effective than any physical punishment. The life of a Roman legionnaire was not only a service, but also a way to secure his future. The salary a soldier received was the basis of his well-being and that of his family. Therefore, monetary penalties were a very sensitive and effective punishment. The system of fines in the Roman army was carefully thought out. For various offenses, from loss of equipment to minor disciplinary violations, certain amounts were deducted from the soldier's pay. These deductions were regular and hit everyone's pocketbook. In addition to fines, there were mandatory deductions. Soldiers paid for food, clothing, shoes, and equipment. There was also a contribution to the unit's fund, which was used to pay for common needs, such as the funerals of comrades. As a result, legionnaires received only a portion of their nominal pay. For many soldiers, this meant living from paycheck to paycheck. Any additional fines could put them in an extremely difficult financial situation. Financial penalties were not only a punishment, but also a means of control. Commanders could use fines to reward or punish soldiers by regulating their financial situation. It was a powerful lever of pressure. Fines hit those who planned to buy land after leaving the service particularly hard. Every coin lost distanced them from their dream of a peaceful life and their own farm. It was a punishment aimed at the future. Some enterprising centurions used the penalty system for personal gain. They could impose unreasonable fines or overcharge for equipment. This led to corruption and discontent among the ranks. For a soldier who risked his life for Rome, financial stability was important. It gave him confidence in the future. The loss of this stability undermined morale. The system of monetary penalties also taught soldiers to be thrifty and responsible. Losing a sword or shield meant not only a tactical problem, but also a serious financial blow. Every legionnaire was interested in preserving his property. Thus, financial leverage was no less important a tool for maintaining discipline than drill training. It allowed soldiers to be controlled without resorting to extreme measures and made service economically dependent on the will of commanders. For a citizen of Rome, there was nothing more terrible than exile. It was not just a move to another place, but a complete erasure from society. The exile lost everything: civil rights, property, family, and his very identity. Imagine a modern person who is suddenly deprived of citizenship, passport, bank accounts, and the right to reside in their home country. Roman exile was an even more severe punishment, since in the ancient world there was no international law or organizations to protect refugees. If you were a Roman citizen sentenced to exile, you would understand that your former life was over forever, not only legally, but also socially, economically, and psychologically. There were several forms of exile. The lightest was temporary removal from Rome for a specified period, but even this was a severe blow to a person's reputation and connections. Temporary exile, or relegatio, could last from several months to several years, but even a short absence from Rome had disastrous consequences for one's career and business connections. In a society where personal relationships and daily presence in the forum determined success, even a year of absence meant the loss of clients, allies, and political opportunities. Imagine a modern politician or businessman who was forcibly removed from the capital for a year. Upon his return, he would find that his place had been taken by competitors and his former connections lost. A more severe form was aquae et ignis interdictio, which meant deprivation of water and fire. A person was forbidden to live in a certain area, and anyone who provided him with shelter or food became a criminal themselves. This was equivalent to a death sentence. The phrase deprivation of water and fire had a deep symbolic meaning. Water and fire were considered the foundations of civilized life, and their deprivation meant a return to a state of savagery. Any Roman citizen who helped such an exile risked their own freedom and well-being. This created a zone of complete isolation around the condemned person, where they could not count on human sympathy. If you encountered such an exile, you would be faced with a painful choice between humanity and law-abidingness. The exile became an outlaw. He was deprived of the protection of Roman law and could become a victim of any arbitrary act. His property was confiscated by the state. The loss of legal protection meant that the exile could be robbed, beaten, or even killed without any legal consequences for the attackers. The confiscation of property took place immediately after the sentence was handed down, and the family of the convicted person often learned of the court's decision when government officials were already sealing their home. Imagine the horror of realizing that you are not only losing your homeland, but also condemning your loved ones, who are not guilty of anything, to poverty. The exile's family also suffered. They bore the stigma of shame, lost their social status, and often found themselves in poverty. The exile of one person destroyed the lives of an entire family. The children of exiles automatically became pariahs in Roman society. They were not accepted into prestigious schools, were denied marriage, and were excluded from public life. The wives of exiles were often forced to divorce in order to preserve at least some social status for themselves and their children. A family name that had been built up over generations could be discredited by a single court decision. If you were related to an exile, you would feel the contempt of society even if you had not committed any crime. For a Roman raised in the cult of ancestors and his hometown, breaking with his roots was an unthinkable tragedy. He became a stranger everywhere, an eternal wanderer without a home or homeland. This punishment was often applied to political opponents. Instead of creating martyrs through public executions, unwelcome politicians were simply removed from public life. It was a quiet but effective way of eliminating competitors. Political exile was a particularly cynical tool of power, as it formally looked like a fair court decision rather than political reprisal. Charges were often based on technical violations or far-fetched interpretations of the law, but the result was always the same: the elimination of an inconvenient opponent. The ruling elite preferred this method of execution because it did not cause popular unrest or create a cult of martyrdom around the victim. Imagine the insidiousness of a system where the law becomes a weapon of political struggle and justice, a mask for revenge. Many famous Romans, such as Cicero and Ovid, experienced the bitterness of exile. Their letters, full of longing for their homeland, testify to the depth of this suffering. For them, life away from Rome lost all meaning. Exile was the ultimate psychological punishment. It did not affect the body, but it destroyed the soul, depriving a person of everything that was dear to them. It was a slow and painful social death. This practice shows how important belonging to their society was to the Romans. Being part of Rome meant everything. Being exiled from it meant nothing. The most sophisticated and truly Roman punishment was Damnatio memoriae, the curse of memory. It was applied to state criminals, usurpers, and emperors who were recognized as enemies of the people. The goal was not simply to take a person's life, but to completely erase them from history. Imagine a modern society where the authorities try to remove all references to an unpopular politician from the internet. Photos, videos, articles, even comments on social media. The Romans carried out a similar operation across the entire empire, using only the manual labor of thousands of people. If you lived in Rome and witnessed such a process, you would understand the full power of the state machine, capable of rewriting reality itself. After the Senate's official verdict, the process of systematically destroying all references to the convicted person began. His name was scraped off inscriptions on temples, arches, and public buildings. It was a titanic task that required the participation of hundreds of people. The process of scraping names out of stone was extremely laborious. Each letter was removed by hand with chisels and hammers, leaving characteristic indentations in the marble. Special teams of stonecutters were sent to all corners of the empire with the sole purpose of finding and destroying every mention of the accursed name. Imagine the scale of this operation. From Britain to Egypt, thousands of people simultaneously scraped away the same name, turning a historical figure into a nameless ghost. All statues and portraits of the condemned man were destroyed. They were smashed, melted down, or remade into images of the new emperor. Any image reminiscent of the criminal had to disappear. The destruction of statues often took place publicly, turning into a political spectacle where the people could express their indignation towards the fallen ruler. Marble heads were smashed with hammers, bronze figures were sent for remelting, and portraits on frescoes were painted over or rewritten. Particularly sophisticated was the transformation of existing statues into images of the new emperor. Sculptors carefully altered facial features, preserving the expensive material but completely changing the personality. Coins bearing the image of the damned ruler were withdrawn from circulation. They were replaced with new ones, as if this person had never been in power. It was a blow to the most obvious symbol of his reign. Coin reform after Damnatio memoriam was a particularly difficult task, as coins were distributed throughout the empire and were in the hands of millions of people. Special decrees required citizens to hand in old coins in exchange for new ones, and merchants were prohibited from accepting damned money. If you had coins bearing the image of the condemned emperor in your wallet, keeping them could be a crime punishable by imprisonment or a fine. Any laws and decrees issued by the condemned emperor were repealed. His will was declared invalid. Everything he had done during his lifetime was declared null and void. The legal annulment of all acts of the convicted person created chaos in the legal system. Thousands of contracts, appointments, land grants, and privileges suddenly lost their legal force. Judges had to review many cases to determine which decisions remained in force and which were subject to annulment. Imagine a situation where all your documents issued under the previous ruler suddenly become invalid, and you have to prove your rights all over again. Even mentioning his name in conversation or in writing could be considered a crime. People were forced to forget that such a person had ever lived. It was total control over historical memory. Paradoxically, it is thanks to Damnatio memoriae that we know about many of these people. Scratched out inscriptions and decapitated statues speak louder than any words about their fate. The attempt to erase memory, on the contrary, created unique historical evidence. Archaeologists and historians have learned to read negative evidence, empty spaces in inscriptions, traces of demolished statues, anomalies in official lists. These holes in history have become a kind of imprint of the damned personalities, preserved despite the desire to destroy them. The irony is that it was precisely the attempt to completely erase them that made these people particularly noticeable to modern researchers. This punishment was the highest form of posthumous humiliation. For a Roman whose ambition was directed toward achieving eternal glory, the prospect of complete oblivion was more terrifying than any physical punishment. The curse of memory demonstrates how seriously the Romans took history and their place in it. They believed that they could control not only the present, but also the past, erasing undesirable pages from it. This method was the ultimate victory over the enemy. They were not simply defeated in battle, but deprived of the most important thing, the right to exist in the memory of posterity. We have looked at 10 methods that Rome used to maintain iron discipline and assert its power. As you can see, many of these tortures were directed not at the body, but at the spirit of a person, at their honor, dignity, and place in society. The Romans were not only great warriors and builders, but also subtle psychologists who understood that the fear of shame and oblivion can be stronger than any weapon. Perhaps it was this cruel but effective system that allowed them to build an empire that lasted for more than 1,000 years. This legacy makes us think about the price of order and what civilizations are willing to do to maintain their power. What other secrets of ancient empires would you like to uncover? Perhaps you are interested in the daily life of gladiators, the secrets of Egyptian priests, or the secret societies of the Middle Ages? Suggest your topics in the comments, and maybe your idea will become the basis for our next issue. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into the past.